A wedding is supposed to be neutral ground, a pause in the rules, a moment where families gather and conflicts wait outside the door. But in Harlem, even celebrations carried weight, because power didn't disappear just because music started playing. And on one spring evening in the early 1950s, a wedding became the place where a long war quietly changed direction. Bumpy Johnson wasn't there as a guest trying to blend in. His presence alone turned the event into a statement. Harlem didn't see him as a criminal attending a ceremony. It saw him as a guarantor, the reason people believed the night would stay intact. That belief is exactly what made the moment valuable to his enemies. Because if you wanted to break Harlem, you didn't attack it on the street. You attacked it where it believed it was safe. The men who planned the ambush understood that. They didn't want chaos later. They wanted shock now. A public strike. Witnesses. A moment so violent that it rewrote the balance instantly. And behind that decision stood a man who believed violence was the fastest way to end problems, Albert Anastasia. What he misjudged wasn't Bumpy's ability to survive the night. It was what came after. Because this story isn't about how many men fell, or how close death came inside a crowded room. It's about why the consequences of that night didn't arrive immediately, and why they were far more devastating because of it. The real outcome didn't happen at the wedding. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, across years, walls, and even prison bars. That's the part most people miss. When Bumpy Johnson was later sent to Alcatraz, many assumed the story was over. The king removed from the board, the threat contained. But power doesn't always live where the body does. Sometimes it survives as memory, information, and patience. This is the story of how a single night planted a consequence that took years to arrive, and why one of the most feared men in American organized crime would eventually die nowhere near Harlem, long after he thought the danger had passed. Because revenge doesn't need speed, and it doesn't need freedom. In Harlem, weddings were never just personal milestones. They were public signals. Who attended mattered, who stood where mattered, and who guaranteed that nothing would go wrong mattered most of all. When a man like Bumpy Johnson appeared at an event like that, it wasn't interpreted as celebration, it was interpreted as assurance. The neighborhood believed that if Bumpy was present, order would hold. That belief is exactly what turned the wedding into a target. For years, Harlem had resisted outside domination, not through constant violence, but through structure. Disputes were contained. Lines were enforced quietly. The community functioned because there was an understanding about where escalation stopped. And at the center of that understanding was Bumpy. He wasn't just protecting territory, he was protecting predictability. A wedding tied to his inner circle amplified that symbolism. It brought together families, local figures, and allies who rarely gathered in one place without tension. It was a moment of visibility, a reminder that Harlem's leadership wasn't hiding, wasn't fractured, and wasn't afraid to exist in public. To enemies watching from the outside, that looked like vulnerability. To Harlem, it looked like confidence. That contrast mattered. The people who planned to disrupt the event weren't aiming for a single death. They were aiming for psychological collapse. If violence could erupt there, in a space meant to be sacred and communal, then nowhere would feel protected. The logic was simple. Break the illusion of safety, and authority would unravel on its own. What they didn't account for was how deeply that authority was woven into the neighborhood itself. Bumpy didn't attend the wedding as a shield expecting to be tested. He attended because not showing up would have sent the wrong message. Canceling or hiding would have implied that fear dictated behavior. In Harlem, that was unacceptable. the event had to proceed, not in spite of danger, but because of it. That decision reframed everything. Once the wedding moved forward, the question was no longer whether violence might occur. The question became who would control its meaning if it did. Would it be interpreted as proof that intimidation worked, or as evidence that even the most aggressive tactics couldn't dismantle the system holding Harlem together? That's why the stakes of that night extended far beyond the room itself. The outcome would signal whether authority in Harlem was conditional, dependent on peace, or resilient enough to absorb shock without collapsing. And when power is tested in a place where people expect safety, the response doesn't just determine who survives the night. It determines who controls the future. To understand why that wedding was chosen, you have to understand how Albert Anastasia solved problems. He didn't negotiate patience, he negotiated fear. For years, that approach had made him indispensable to the Mafia's enforcement wing, and untouchable in the streets. When something resisted him, he escalated until resistance broke. It was efficient, it was visible, and it had worked often enough to feel universal. Harlem was the exception he couldn't accept. From Anastasia's perspective, the situation looked irrational. A neighborhood that refused to submit despite repeated pressure. A local power broker who didn't retreat when challenged. No decisive confrontation to end the dispute. To a man who believed authority had to be demonstrated publicly, that restraint looked like defiance. And defiance in his world demanded correction. So Anastasia framed the problem incorrectly. He assumed Harlem's stability was fragile, that it depended on the perception of safety more than the reality of structure. Break that perception in the most public way possible, and everything else would fall apart. A wedding offered exactly that opportunity. A crowded, symbolic event where violence would echo far beyond the room itself. What he failed to recognize was that Harlem's order wasn't built on the absence of violence. It was built on the containment of it. Anastasia believed shock created obedience. In Harlem, shock created scrutiny. Witnesses didn't scatter into silence, they remembered. Communities didn't fracture, they compared notes. Violence there didn't erase authority. It invited questions about who could stop it and who couldn't. That distinction is where Anastasia miscalculated most severely. By choosing a moment of maximum visibility, he forced the response to be just as visible. Not in bloodshed, but in control. If the attack failed to dissolve the event into chaos, then the message reversed itself. Instead of proving dominance, it would expose limits. Instead of ending resistance, it would harden it. Anastasia also underestimated the role of time. He believed outcomes were immediate. Either fear took hold or it didn't. He didn't account for delayed consequences, for the idea that a single night could plant a response that matured quietly, far from the scene, over years rather than hours. That belief cost him dearly, because when a man who relies on instant terror faces someone willing to wait, the balance tilts slowly but decisively. And by the time Anastasia realized that the wedding wasn't a trap for Bumpy, but a test of systems, the mistake had already been locked in. He had chosen spectacle over strategy. And in Harlem, that choice never ended well. When warnings reached Bumpy Johnson, they didn't arrive as certainty. They came as fragments, dates mentioned too carefully, unfamiliar faces asking routine questions, small disruptions that suggested planning rather than coincidence. For most men, that kind of information triggers avoidance. You postpone, you relocate, you reduce exposure. Bumpy did the opposite. Canceling the wedding would have solved the immediate risk, but it would have created a larger problem. In Harlem, absence spoke louder than announcements. Not showing up would have confirmed that fear could dictate public life. It would have reframed authority as conditional, present only when safe. Bumpy understood that once that line was crossed, every future gathering would carry the same doubt. So the day stayed on the calendar. That decision wasn't stubbornness. It was a calculation about what power actually protects. Bumpy wasn't interested in preserving a night at the expense of the system behind it. If violence was coming, he intended to make sure it didn't define the meaning of the event. He would let the moment exist, but not on his enemy's terms. Preparation followed a different logic than evacuation. Instead of concentrating protection in obvious ways, Bumpy spread it thin and ordinary. Familiar faces stayed in place. Routines remained intact. The goal wasn't to look ready for trouble. It was to ensure that if trouble arrived, it would encounter resistance that felt inevitable rather than reactive. He also chose not to alarm the community. Panic travels faster than plans, and panic fractures trust. Bumpy knew that once fear entered the room, control would leak out of it. By keeping the tone normal, he preserved the one advantage Harlem always relied on: collective composure. People who aren't afraid think clearly. People who think clearly don't surrender control easily. Most importantly, Bumpy made peace with uncertainty. He didn't know exactly how many men were involved, or where every risk sat. He accepted that incomplete information was part of leadership. The goal wasn't omniscience, it was resilience. If the structure could absorb surprise without collapsing, then the attack itself would lose its strategic value. By the time the ceremony began, the question was no longer whether something might happen. It was whether the event would be remembered as a rupture or as proof. Proof that authority didn't depend on preventing every threat, only on deciding what those threats ultimately meant. That's why Bumpy stayed. Because sometimes the strongest response to danger isn't avoidance. It's presence. The moment arrived without ceremony. Not as a sudden explosion of noise, but as a break in rhythm, the kind that people feel before they understand. Conversations stalled. Music thinned. Attention shifted toward the wrong place. That's when Bumpy Johnson acted. Not to create a scene, but to prevent one from spreading. This is where most accounts focus on violence. They miss the more important detail: containment. The room didn't dissolve into panic. It tightened. Movement became directional. People followed cues without being told why. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when a space already recognizes who sets the limits. What had been designed as a public humiliation failed to hijack the room. The disruption was isolated, absorbed, and closed. There was no stampede, no uncontrolled retaliation, no spectacle that could be replayed later as proof that terror worked. Instead, the night corrected itself. Order reasserted without applause. That correction mattered more than any individual outcome. Across the city, word traveled fast, but not the way planners expected. The story wasn't about fear overwhelming a celebration. It was about a celebration that refused to collapse, about authority that didn't evaporate when challenged publicly, and about a man who didn't need to raise his voice to make the point understood. For Albert Anastasia, that was the worst possible result. He had invested in visibility, believing that witnesses would amplify intimidation. Instead, witnesses amplified restraint. The very crowd meant to multiply fear ended up validating control. And once that narrative took hold, there was no way to reverse it with more force. Escalation after that night would have required admitting failure. Any follow-up attack would look desperate. Any renewed pressure would confirm that the first move hadn't worked. The option set narrowed rapidly. Either retreat quietly or risk turning a miscalculation into an open admission that intimidation no longer guaranteed obedience. That's why nothing dramatic followed immediately. The absence of retaliation wasn't mercy. It was strategy. By stopping exactly where he did, Bumpy denied his opponent the oxygen needed to continue. No chaos to exploit, no outrage to harness, no justification for further intrusion into Harlem without looking reckless. When violence fails to produce leverage, it becomes expensive noise. By the end of the night, everyone who mattered understood something fundamental had shifted. Not because of who fell, but because of who controlled the ending. Authority hadn't been challenged and reclaimed. It had been demonstrated, calmly, publicly, and without excess. And once a community sees that happen, it doesn't forget. What surprised outsiders wasn't what happened that night. It was what didn't happen afterward. There was no wave of retaliations, no sudden flare-up across borough lines, no cycle of revenge meant to restore pride. In a world where violence was often used to save face, the silence that followed felt unnatural. But to anyone who understood how power actually worked in Harlem, it made perfect sense. Bumpy Johnson had no interest in prolonging the conflict. Prolonged violence would have shifted attention away from the lesson and toward the spectacle. It would have created martyrs, hardened positions, and invited outside forces, police, politicians, rival crews, to intervene. That kind of chaos benefits no one who already controls the ground. The war ended because it no longer served a purpose. From Anastasia's perspective, the situation had become unstable. The strategy he trusted most had failed publicly. Escalating would mean admitting that intimidation alone couldn't resolve the problem. Retreating was humiliating, but continuing was dangerous. Every additional move risked turning a contained loss into an irreversible collapse of authority. So Anastasia adjusted tactics. Instead of street violence, pressure shifted toward quieter channels. Investigations, indictments, legal exposure. It was an attempt to reassert control without revisiting a battlefield that no longer favored him. This transition itself was a concession. It acknowledged that Harlem could not be conquered through force without unacceptable costs. Bumpy understood that shift immediately. He didn't respond by chasing shadows or provoking further confrontation. He allowed the legal pressure to arrive because he knew something Anastasia didn't. Courts and prisons remove bodies, not influence. The structure that protected Harlem didn't depend on his constant presence. It depended on shared understanding, and that understanding had already been reinforced. By refusing to escalate, Bumpy froze the conflict in its least advantageous state for his enemy. The balance couldn't be reset with gunfire, and it couldn't be reclaimed quickly through law. Time, once again, became the decisive factor. That's how wars truly end in the underworld. Not with treaties, not with victory speeches. They end when one side realizes that every available move makes their position worse, and chooses to stop moving at all. And in Harlem, that moment arrived quietly, just days after the wedding, when the city returned to normal and everyone understood who had absorbed the shock without breaking. The fighting stopped because it no longer needed to continue. Years later, people would argue about what really ended the conflict. Some pointed to the violence of that night, others to the arrests that followed. But the truth sat somewhere quieter, in the stretch of time where nothing happened and everyone understood why. Bumpy Johnson never treated revenge as an emotional obligation. For him, it was a structural problem. You didn't answer force with noise. You answered it by letting consequences mature until they became unavoidable. That's why the most important part of this story doesn't live at the wedding, or even in Harlem. It lives in the years that followed. When Bumpy was removed from the streets and sent to Alcatraz, many assumed the balance would reset. Kings fall when you cage them. That's how power is supposed to work. But Harlem didn't unravel. The rules didn't disappear. The memory of what had been proven stayed intact, and that memory traveled. Far from Harlem, far from the wedding, far from the noise, Albert Anastasia continued operating as if time had erased the risk. He believed distance was safety, that silence meant resolution. What he didn't understand was that delayed consequences don't announce themselves. They arrive when the structure around you is already compromised. When Anastasia finally fell, years later, it looked like internal politics, a routine power shift. Officially, it had nothing to do with Harlem. That's what made the message so complete. No fingerprints, no declarations, just an ending that arrived after everyone had stopped watching for it. That's why this story lasts. Not because of how many men died or how close chaos came, but because it showed something rarer. That power doesn't need speed, it doesn't need freedom, and it doesn't need to explain itself. Some men rule by being feared in the moment. Others rule by being remembered over time. And the most dangerous ones are those who can do both. Quietly, patiently, and without ever needing to say why.